Yep. Cool.
Okay. I said I wasn't going to do it. I have to say I hit record because I can't help that because I'm OCD. All right, so let's start off talking about the not new, newer book, three-story method for writing scenes,
Yeah.
which I absolutely love. It's a really, and I've used it with multiple clients already. Um, so what it does is it takes the three-story method, which is a look at like plotting through the lens of challenge, conflict, and consequences, challenge, choices, and conflict consequences. You think I'd know this? I am a three-story method editor. And then takes it down to a scene level. So I was talking with some of the dialoguers, and they really wanted to know like what has been the biggest mistake you've seen authors making at the scene level, um, that kind of pushed you to work this book in this direction?
Yeah, man. I love that question because it just gets right to it, right? It's
Yeah,
like
let's just
we
go
don't we
at it.
don't care about where this book came from. Just tell us what's
Yeah,
the biggest mistake we're all making.
that's right.
All right.
Why did you write this?
Yeah, I love that. I love it. Yeah, that's probably the most insightful question that you can ask any writing coach, mentor, editor, right? Like, what's the most common thing you see? Because when you get into a situation like we are, where you're seeing a lot of work, or you're editing a lot of work, you start to pick up these patterns. You start to notice things that people do over and over again, and you're very good at, especially with dialogue, at recognizing that. So here's the short answer. This could even save you from buying the book. If you want more information, you
No,
can
you
buy
still
the
have to
book.
go buy the book. You still have to buy the book.
Here it is. It's right here. And this goes all the way back to my first clients in 2017. So over the past 5 years, what I've seen consistently from writers at every level, and in every situation, is the choice. It is so if we take a look at the three C's from three-story method, it's conflict, choice, and consequence, right? The conflict is the thing that starts the scene. It pushes the protagonist out of the status quo towards a choice. And then once they make the choice, there's a consequence. Now, that sounds super simple. And you and I can be like, oh, yeah, of course, like you need a choice. But over and over and over again, what I've noticed is that most writers write easy or weak choices. And so, like, here's what that means. Like, if your character is simply moving through a scene and they're not forced to make a choice, it's extremely passive, and that translates as boring to the reader. Right. So the reader wants to live vicariously through the character. The reader wants to be thinking, what would I do in that situation? So if you present a choice to the character that's super easy or lame, there's no interest for the reader to follow that. So most authors instinctively know that they have to have a choice. So it's not that a choice is missing, although for very new writers, that's often the case. But if you've been writing for any length of time, typically the choice is the first idea that came to the author, or the choice is so black and white. There's no interest in turning the page, right? When you talk about a page turner, what drives the page turner is, oh my gosh, I have to find out what's going to happen next.
Mm.
If you set up a super direct, easy choice where like you have an excellent option or a terrible option, for the reader, there's no suspense there. Like, I know what the character is going to do, right? So that's it. It's choice. And to dig a little deeper on that, one of the pushbacks I get is, well, I write XYZ genre, and in my genre, there's not always a lot of high stakes, super action fights. Substitute in whatever you want there. And my response is, the choice doesn't always have to be overt. It doesn't have to be high stakes. It doesn't even have to involve physical motion. Like, you could have two people in a coffee shop having a conversation, and in that dialogue, you can embed a choice for the character.
Mm.
So that's the misconception, is like, well, I write in a genre where it's more subtle, and my pushback is, it's never too subtle to not have a choice,
Mm.
because that's it. So some of the ways around that is, when I whether you're writing a scene or revising a scene, come up with 4 or 5 choices, because what's going to happen is you're going to grab the first choice off the top of your head. That's the one that you have consumed the most as a storyteller. It's your go-to, and chances are it's going to be the one the reader is going to expect, i.e., less interesting. So if you say, okay, this could be the choice, or maybe this is the choice, or maybe this is the choice, and you write several, you're going to start getting down into the really good stuff. So that's one option. Another option is if you have a choice that you think really works and you want to use it and you don't want to explore other options, then try to make that choice as difficult as possible for the character. So, if the characters in your scene, the choice is to get up in the morning and go to work, or to roll over and go back to sleep, that's a lame choice. There's nothing exciting about that, right?
Yeah.
It's too easy on multiple levels. Or if the choice is to go to work or go rob a bank, they're probably going to go to work, right?
Yeah.
So that's it. It really comes down to choice at the scene level. You got to have a choice for your character in every single scene. The choice has to be interesting to the reader, and it has to be hard for the character.
That's interesting. What do you say to writers who push back and go, well, the problem, Jay, is that my character is very passive and the world is happening around them?
Then I would say you have a problem with your character.
I was hoping you'd say that.
Because what you have to honor is you have to honor tens of thousands of years of storytelling tradition. And if you like, Brian McDonald's great. One of my favorite people when it comes to storytelling and writing. And what he basically says is that we tell stories as a survival mechanism. So what we do is we tell stories as a way to warn people of danger. All right. So that if you go all the way back to, the quote unquote caveman days, and it's like, hey, I was walking down that path and a tiger jumped out. Like that's a survival mechanism to tell others don't walk down that path. Yeah. We're clearly more sophisticated than that now, but that's it. That's the whole idea. Fiction, nonfiction, whether you're in a bar, whether you're telling a joke, you're transmitting survival information. You're helping other people out. So if you have a character who never makes a choice, they're going to die, right? Like on multiple levels. They're going to be emotionally dead. They're going to be intellectually dead. They could be physically dead, right? So the choice is absolutely essential. I don't think you can tell stories that people are going to want to engage with unless they involve choice.
Yeah. I love it. That's super wise wisdom. You personally, do you plot choices out before you write a scene, or do you discover them and then rewrite them as you write?
It depends on the project. I've done it. I do it both ways.
Okay.
If I'm on a project where I feel like I need to know what the puzzle pieces are, then I'm more likely to sketch out a possible choice. But that's not to say that I get into the scene and I get this moment where I go, oh, wait a minute, this would be a much better idea, and then I'll play with that. So I don't think it matters if you're a plotter or a pantser as far as your approach. I think the important thing to recognize is by the scene's end, you need to have provided a learning opportunity for the reader, a survival tidbit, and you do that through choice.
I love that. I'm going to actually steal that illustration of survival to start explaining why I wrote my last book. So yeah, that's really great. Okay, I'm going to pivot. I want to talk about entrepreneurship, because I am a very risk averse person, and it is not an exaggeration to say that none of this dialogue doctor stuff would exist if you had come alongside me with your incredible entrepreneurship passion and brain and been like, hey, move. So that so I'm incredibly grateful for that, and I just want to kind of pick that brain a little bit. So what is it about finding new projects and finding new things, new avenues, that because you have always, I know you always have like multiple projects going on, and also like 3 in the hopper. that you that you're like that you haven't shared with anybody yet, but you're just like ruminating on. So what is it about that that excites you? Like what about that gets you going?
Well, a couple things before I answer that. First of all, I want to say that that I'm extremely proud of what you've accomplished with Dialogue Doctor,
Oh, thanks, man.
and we may have talked about it, and I may have helped you get it off the ground, but what you've done over the past couple of years has been entirely yours, and I'm super proud of that, and just thrilled that you've been able to carve out a space for yourself. So
Thanks, man.
I want to get that off the top. The other thing I want to say, and I'm not trying to be I'm not trying to be cagey about this, but
No, BKG is great.
I don't
Just be prepared for more questions.
I'm not an entrepreneur.
What?
I'm not.
No. Okay, talk
All
about
right.
that.
So this I think I've so I have a history. I was assistant director of an entrepreneurial studies program for a high powered high school before I left the day job. And what I learned in that time is that entrepreneurs are people who identify a problem and they develop a solution for it. All right, that's what it's at
Okay.
its core. So
Yeah.
if we take like the low hanging fruit on that, the example, and I hate to use it because it's mostly young white dudes in Silicon Valley, but for the sake of example, let's take an app, right?
Yeah.
All right, if you see a problem, the problem is cabs are dirty. I never there's a problem getting a cab when I want one, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Fast forward, you have Uber, right? So there was an entrepreneur who saw a problem, developed a solution for it. All right, that is not what I do.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair.
It is not
Yeah,
what
that's
and
totally
like
fair.
so it's really buzzwordy and it's really catchy right now to throw a preneur suffix on everything, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
there's authorpreneur and solopreneur and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
mompreneur and dadpreneur, right? And I'm not disparaging any of that. Like it's a great little marketing thing and it's a nice play on words, but it's just not accurate.
Interesting.
Like
Yeah.
my perspective is that entrepreneurs have great starting energy. They identify the problem, they come up with the solution, and they have an exit strategy. They hand it off to like they sell it to somebody else, and they do it again, right?
Interesting. Okay.
Serial entrepreneurs have this cycle of this, right? And that's why you get these people who end up in they've sold 4, 5, 7 companies because this is the cycle of entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
So what we're doing and what people who use the preneur suffix tend to do is they're creative business people. And I'm not saying that's any less important or irrelevant, and I'm not placing a judgment on that. But there's a difference between being an entrepreneur and a business person. So what I consider myself to be is I'm a business person. I haven't identified a problem out there and come up with a solution. I'm working in a very old traditional industry, and I'm coming up with creative ideas within it. Like writing or storytelling is thousands of years old. The publishing industry is hundreds of years
Hundreds
old.
of thousands of years old.
Yeah, right. Like so, I'm not
In
an
its soul.
entrepreneur,
Yeah.
right? And I've tried to move away from that. I think I just by default, and a lot of people use entrepreneur and business person synonymously, and they're not the same. And
Yeah.
again, like there's no judgment laced in that. I'm just saying that the what an entrepreneur does is very different than what a business person does. So typically a business person will identify a market, a niche or a genre, and then they stick in that. And they might be verticals, like there might be, products or services that are a little to the left or to the right, but they're not jumping from one thing to another the way entrepreneurs do. So again, I'm not trying to be cagey. I'm not trying to punt on your question. I just don't think we're the people with it. You and I in our circles, I don't think we're entrepreneurs.
Yeah, no, and I actually really love your answer. I think for me, before your answer just now, I think I would think like an entrepreneur is somebody who starts something new. Like that's just like that's just like, but I like what the problem with that like simplistic definition of it is that it brings on all kinds of expectations of flipping, of like rapid growth. Like successful entrepreneurs have rapid growth that then flips, and it brings on expectations of like, okay, what's the newest thing? So yeah, so I actually I really appreciate the distinction. I think that, yeah, and I'm probably gonna wrestle with that for like another Couple days. So thanks, Jay. You always do this to me, man. I'm always like,
I'm
I
sorry.
haven't figured out. And then I talk to Jay and he's like, you have nothing figured out. I'm like,
I don't have it figured out.
I come
That
out
I think
better on
that's
the other
cool.
end. So what is it that, like, when you're pursuing creative opportunities, does that excite you or does that bring you anxiety?
Well, it's both. I think it has to be both. I think if you're too confident about an idea, uh, then it's not the right idea. Like it's
Huh.
like I almost and I think this would translate to authors as well. I think if you come up with if you sit down and you blueprint a bestseller, it's almost not going to be a bestseller. Right? Like if you're too confident, you're like, oh my God, this is going to crush. I totally know this is going to work. It probably won't. And I don't know why that's the case. I think there might be some sort of universal mystic energy that's involved there, but I kind of feel like when you're starting something new,
The muse is
uh,
just like, no.
yeah, like
Yeah.
I think you need to feel a sense of urgency isn't the right word. Destiny, and you can't help it. Like you have to try this out,
Yeah.
but that doesn't necessarily mean you think it's going to work. And I've said this in different ways at different times, but you know, I wish the Pareto principle worked for me. I wish 8 out of 10 things worked, but it's more, yeah, or 2 out of 10 things worked. It's more like one or maybe a
Yeah.
half,
Yeah. I was
you
about to
know?
say.
And I think that's what makes me a creative business person, is that I come up with a million ideas and I know that very few of them are ever going to work.
Huh. How do you, besides having like a balance of confidence and fear around it, how do you know when an idea is strong enough to pursue?
Well, what I used to do is I didn't care about that. I only, I
That might
didn't,
affect your ratio.
yeah, probably. I didn't care. Like what I wanted to do, I had something I wanted to build, and damn it, I was going to build it.
Oh,
And then after I built it, I would try and sell it. And I
okay.
think that's what most people do.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's why most businesses fail. Like if you just look at statistics for businesses in, let's say, the United States in the past 100 years, almost every business fails, and most of them fail within the first 5 years.
Mm.
And the reason I think that's the case is because most businesses start with a founder or an owner who has something they really want to build, and then they build it, and then they go and try and find people to buy it. And that, like, that's like a lightning strike. Like, 1 out of 100 times it's gonna work, but most of the time it won't. And I think that is something that the internet has changed. So we
Mm.
haven't caught up with it, but the internet has changed that. So what I used to do is I would say, oh, this would be really cool. Whether it might have been a novel, it could have been a course, it could have been anything, a podcast. Oh, this is going to be really cool. And I just go start building it because I like it.
Mm.
And then I get it out, and then I put it out there, and I find out that no one else wants it.
Interesting.
And
It feels very much like an inventor's type attitude.
yes, yeah, I guess it could be, right? Like an inventor has something they really want to work on, and so they
Hmm.
go and they work on it.
Yeah.
Um,
And then they're like, who else wants this thing?
yeah, right. And I think the difference, like when you're a business person, like if you're an inventor, that might be okay because you enjoy the process of inventing. You don't really care what comes after it. But
Mm.
if you're a business person and your livelihood depends on you being able to sell what you create, that's a really terrible approach to
Yeah. Yeah.
business,
Mm.
right? So what I've done, what I started doing, and I started this a couple years ago, and I'm not perfect at it. I still build stuff first, but I'm much better at catching it now. I have this thing I made up. It's called the PayPal page test. Um, I I don't know if it's a terrible term to coin, but I'll claim it, I guess. But what I do now is I come up with an idea, and when I have that idea, I then will test it by going to a small group of people, and I send them a link to a PayPal page, and I say, "Hey, I got this thing. Are you interested? And if you're interested, here's the link to subscribe, purchase, reserve, whatever it happens to be." Now, here's why it has to be a PayPal link, because I know people were thinking like, "Wow, so you're collecting money?" I'm like, you have to, because
Huh.
if I say to you, Hey, Jeff, I'm thinking about building this tool that would really make creating settings easier. Would you buy it?
Yeah,
You'd
sure.
be
Cool,
like,
cool,
oh,
cool,
of
cool, cool.
course.
Yeah.
Totally.
Do your
Right.
thing, man. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Right. Like if someone said, oh, if they build a 24-hour Planet Fitness next to your house, would you work out every day? Oh, yeah. I'd
Yeah. Be
totally
there at
do that.
6 a.m.
Apps
every
every
day.
day. Every
Yeah.
day.
Let's
Right.
do it.
So the only way you really know if someone values the idea is if they're willing to open their wallet for it.
Huh.
So, and it's kind of risk free because what I'll do is I'll put up this PayPal page and I'll ask people to buy it. And then if let's say one or two people buy it and I need 10 people to buy it, then I just turn around to those one or two people and I refund their money. I'm like, sorry, I didn't get enough. There weren't enough people who were interested. No one's ever complained about that. Everyone's like, oh, okay, I understand. Thanks
Yeah.
for refunding the money. But what that does is it forces me to focus on things that people want. And even in the author life community, like I recently did this. I said, hey, I'm thinking about having an old school writers retreat. No speakers, no programming, no PowerPoint slides. Let's just get together. I'll find cool places where we can write. We'll hang out, we'll eat, we'll laugh, we'll tell jokes, but we're just here to write. We're just going to take a weekend to write. And I said, if you're interested, here's the PayPal link. Here are the dates. Sign up. I didn't have to build a landing page.
Yep.
I didn't have to develop a program. I didn't have to come up with a marketing plan. I didn't have to do an email campaign. I just basically said, here's to pay or not. And if you pay, then I know you're interested.
Yep. I'm laughing because you put that link up and I was like, well, if you did ask me to pay for it, I would have said yes. I was that guy. I was the guy who was like, yeah, it's a great idea. Let's do it. And you're like, okay, so can you put down a couple $100? Oh no, I can't do that.
Timing's not good, right? And again, like I don't have any judgment about that. Like I totally get, because I do this, right? People will say, hey, what do you think about this idea? And I'm like, yeah, awesome. But if you ask me to pay for it, I have to recalibrate and I'm gonna go, wait a minute, let me think about this, because whether you like it or not, we live in a capitalist society, especially if you're in a Western country. This is just the way it is. And you can be upset about it, which at times I am, or you can just recognize that this is how we place value on things. It's with dollars. So I don't, it's harder to do. I think it can be harder to do, but if you kind of reshift, if it's a paradigm shift, you can do this in different ways. Like let's say it's a book idea for authors, like you can put a link up for a almost like a pre-sale kind of a simple pre-sale link, like send it to 100 people and then decide ahead of time, what is the tipping point for you? Like, is it 50? Is it 60? Is it 70? What percentage of people opening their wallets would motivate you to create the product,
to do the thing? Yeah.
And then do it. And if you don't hit it, then just refund the money. And you've saved yourself so much time and energy.
It's interesting. It feels like that would help you overcome the I think barrier a lot of us have, which is the, like, I don't remember the official name for it, but it's like, I've invested X amount in this, therefore I have to keep it going.
That's the sunk cost fallacy.
The sunk cost, cost fallacy.
Yeah.
Do you find this system helps you like fight that off?
Oh yeah, it totally does, because once people have paid, now for me as a creator, I have this real burning sense of obligation. I'm like, all right, people are trusting me with their hard-earned money and they're expecting me to develop this experience for them. And now I have no reservations, because I'm not thinking like, well, is this going to sell or not? Like if I go and map out an entire weekend retreat and then I put up a landing page and I ask people to buy it and no one buys it, that is demoralizing. Like that is, you can only do that so many times before you're like, screw this. This is terrible, So I will say though, there's one little catch here, and that is, I think you really need a small number of people. I hesitate to call it a community. Maybe it's an audience. Maybe it's an email list. You do need a small number of people, and I don't know what that's going to be for you or for your project. But let's say, like I think it could be 100 people, right? Like if you had a mailing list and you had 100 people on it, and you wanted to test this out, you wanted to build something, but you didn't want to spend the time building it until you knew people were going to pay for it, you could send a PayPal link to that 100 people, and that might be enough, right? If you have absolutely zero people, if you're not in any communities, if you don't have any mailing lists, it's good. Like, who do you put that link in front of? Because you're
Yeah.
unknown, right? So there's a little bit of an asterisk there. But again, even a few dozen people, if you have a few dozen people to put that in front of, I mean, the Author
Yeah.
Life community, I posted that in Slack. There's 240 people in that community. It's not like 15,000 people, you know? You
Yeah.
just need a very small number of people, and then percentage wise, decide ahead of time where's the threshold for you? Where's the point between I'm not going to do this versus I am going to do it? And this is something that comes up over and over again in business and entrepreneurial talks. Seth Godin wrote the book on it called The Dip, right? Like, at what point do you stop
Do you
versus
pull
push
out?
through?
Yeah.
And I think you preempt that. Like, if you know already before you build something, then you never even get to a dip.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've struggled with that dip so much. Fun fact, if you write Seth Godin an email about it, he will email you back.
Yes, he will.
He will right away. He'll like hit you right back. Sometimes it takes a day or two, but you always get a response. Because I've sent like crying emails about like, I don't know how much I'm gonna go on. And several times he's just written me an email with one sentence, go reread the dip.
Yeah.
I think so. So I'm gonna ask a question that's off book, so you don't have, if you just don't want to answer it, you can just tell me no. I've heard you talk about, I've heard you choose over the past couple of years, smaller, intimate opportunities over scale. Would you mind talking about that a little bit? I'm just curious.
Yeah.
If you can say no, if you don't want
No,
to talk about
no,
it,
it's
you can
fine. I think you broke up on the end of it. So you were saying
Oh,
small, intimate opportunities versus larger
versus
ones. I'm assuming.
scale. Yeah, like
Yeah,
versus scaling something out.
yeah. I think this is something I learned that is entirely personal. So this advice or my experience might not be relevant to everyone, but what I discovered in the past 5 years is that the things I really enjoy doing don't scale. And that was kind of a bitter pill to swallow, because the whole ethos of the internet entrepreneur is scale, get it to scale, right? Passive income, sit on the beach and do nothing, make
Yeah.
money while you sleep, right?
Build a log
And
cabin. Yeah.
yeah, and like
Yeah.
that kind of stuff works if you scale. But I discovered, and I tried, I tried many things that scale, and I didn't enjoy them. I didn't enjoy the process. I didn't enjoy the outcome. It has nothing to do with the people who were involved. It's all on me. It's a work preference that I have. So I'll give you an example. You know, my first big foray into author services, shortly after StoryGrid certification, was doing the Somewhere Book Show Summit with Zach and Jim Kukral and Brian Cohen. And this was by no means like a 20 books to 50K size conference. I mean, we had 150 people there, but still 150 people. That was that's something that scaled, right? Like, if we had kept doing it, we could have scaled that event up to thousands. We would have known how to do that. But what I discovered after that conference, and then Zach and I did Authors on a Train, where we were working with 8 or 10 or 12 people, is I liked that second one better. I liked being able to sit around a table with people and talk. I like to be able to move together as a small group, to have intimate conversations, to get to know people on a very personal level. And so for me, through personal experience, I realized that I enjoy those types of events and those types of connections much more than the bigger ones. I think there's a place for those conferences, and I'm not saying I'll never do them again, but I think for me, identifying how I like to spend my time is more important than how much money I make out of it. And so I could make a whole lot of money if I scaled up a big conference. I know that. But that, I don't want to spend my time doing something I don't like. Otherwise, what's the point? Like, am I saving someday? Like, am I going to do things I hate to do so that someday I can enjoy my life? Like, in the meantime, I'm wasting my life, right? I'm wasting my life in hopes of some future date where I flip a switch and all of a sudden I can do what I want. Like, why don't I do what I want now?
Yeah.
As long as I can make a little bit of money, as long as I can make enough money to sustain my lifestyle, then why am I delaying something for decades? So I think that's been my move towards these smaller, intimate group gatherings as opposed to the bigger things. And I think that translates into all of my author services and all of my business ventures. I'm really thinking about the small size. I think even with, and this is a bit off topic, and some of your listeners might might skip through this now that I'm going to bring it up, but like Web3 and NFTs and like in that space, what I'm seeing in the music industry as I'm paying attention to this thing unfold in real time before my eyes is that there are creators who now, with a few dozen people, are making a living. A few dozen people, like that's never been possible before. So
Literally, right.
yeah, I don't think like whether it's the PayPal link page or doing things that don't scale, the internet and now blockchain and Web3 are making things possible that have never been possible in the history of being an artist before. So I'm incredibly optimistic about it. And for those people who don't want to scale or don't want to do those massive things, I don't think you're going to have to.
That's nice. That's nice to hear for somebody like me who's just bad at scaling. I don't know that it's a choice, an active choice I'm making. I'm just not good at it. So it's so
Well,
yeah.
you know, with scale comes responsibilities. You know, like it's the same issue you have. It's not an issue, but it's the same thing you have with income, right? Like there are studies that have identified, and take it with a grain of salt because you know these are not highly scientific studies, but there are studies that have been done that say if you live in the United States, $100,000 a year is kind of the sweet spot. Like up until $100,000 a year, you have money problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
At $100,000 a year, you can kind of live pretty comfortably and not have to worry day to day or live paycheck to paycheck.
Mm-hmm.
But once you go north of 100,000, your life doesn't get that much better. And I've never been there, but I would argue that when you get way north of 100,000, like if you're 10xing it, all you're doing is creating a different set of responsibilities, problems, concerns,
Sure.
whether that's taxes, whether that's real estate properties, whether that's investments. And I'm sure we'd all like to be very wealthy, but I also believe that that doesn't mean wealthy people don't have problems.
Yeah. Yeah. So going with this, I agree. And that's a complicated, that's a weird, yeah. Anyway, sorry, my mind was chasing 1,000 things, and we're gonna focus, because this isn't like Jeff Ramble time. So knowing that like you're going for these more intimate experiences, not trying to scale, how does that impact the life cycle of the project you have? Did I break up there? I got to
No,
notice that I broke up. Okay.
no. So no, that's a great question. Can you explain a little bit what you mean by life cycle of the project?
Sure. Like everything has a birth and a death, right? Like whether it's, it doesn't matter how great it is. It's either going to die or radically change so that it no longer resembles the thing that it was when it started, which
Yeah.
is like, does actually feel like a death. Like when you get to those moments where you're like, oh, this is shifting to something that I didn't intend. It feels like something died. So, everything changes. Nothing is like, you don't start something and then it lasts forever. So how does that, like going for more intimate experiences, are you finding that expands the lifespan of something that rather than scaling, or is it shortening the lifespan? Like how does that work?
Well, this is such a great question. I don't know if I've articulated this before. So we talked a little bit before we started recording about how crazy the world is right now or how it feels right now, right? Like for all we know, like our great grandparents might have been saying the same things. Like it
Yeah.
might have been World War I and the Spanish flu, and who knows? Like they might have been like, "Oh my gosh, this world's crazier than it's ever been." So
Yeah.
I'm acknowledging that. Like,
Yeah.
but whether it's that way or not doesn't matter if that's our perception of it. So
Yeah.
right now, to me, the world feels incredibly chaotic, uncertain, volatile, and so my approach now, and this really doesn't have anything to do with scale as much as it does circumstances. My approach right now is nothing I create is going to last past one. Like it might, but it probably won't.
Yeah.
So like, because I think we get emotionally attached to stuff. So like,
Mhm.
I'll give you a good example. Authors on a Train. Like when we Zach and I came up with that idea way before the pandemic and everything went crazy. And then the pandemic totally wrecked that event. And it might not ever come back. I don't know. Like we wrapped up the last one literally weeks before the world shut down.
Mm.
And we kind of have kicked it around a few times since, and there is an interest. Like, people are just not ready to have that kind of experience again. So I could choose to be emotionally attached to it and keep trying and be sad about it and fight it, or I could just accept the fact that that is not the kind of event that people want right now. And if they want it again, then we'll be able to offer it, and we'll have the blueprint, and we can kind of revive it pretty easily. We can adapt it. But right now, that's just not something that people want. It's not something they're interested in. And I think my approach now over the past, say, 2.5 years has been, I don't expect anything to last past one. Like, podcasts. Like, I start a podcast knowing full well there's going to be a time when this podcast is going to end. And I might want it to run for years, but it might run months. I have no control over that. I don't control the externalities of the situation. So whether it's a book, whether it's a package, a course, I build things now like we talked about. I build things I know that people are going to pay for, and then I have that experience, and that's great. And if I can do it, if I can replicate it and do it again, fantastic. But I don't have that expectation. The flip side to that is it puts a ton of pressure on me to innovate. If you're the type of person who likes to create something and just do it over and over and over again, the world is in such a state that you're going to be in for some pain. Like, I'm just being real. Like, like, if you want to do the same thing for the next 5 years, I can't even look 5 months out and tell you with any certainty the way things are going to be. I don't, people talk about making a 5-year plan and a 10-year plan, and like, that might make you feel good.
It's really cute.
But what good would have a 5-year plan done you 5 years ago?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm hearing you say that one of the ways you kind of avoid emotional entanglement with projects ending is by setting expectations up front.
Yes. My expectation up front is, if someone pays for this and it happens once, it's a success. And everything after that is gravy.
Interesting. Anything else you want? You think, like, authors who are thinking about author services or thinking about, a different type of book launch or whatever creative business endeavor they're doing. Anything else we haven't talked about that should be like, hey, this is something you need to keep in mind?
I mean, everything we've talked about, it might not seem like it on the surface, but I believe it applies to people who are just want to, quote unquote, write books, right?
Mm.
We run into that persona a lot. Like, I don't care about the marketing. I don't want to do advertising. I don't know about social media. I just want to do the writing. You can't, like, now I should say you can't if you want to make money, right? If you want to have a business, if you want to earn income from writing, then you can't ignore all that stuff. If you love to write and you've got a great day job and it's a hobby or a pastime or something you do in retirement, do whatever the hell you want. Like, it really doesn't matter, right? Write what you want, do what you want.
Enjoy that freedom.
Enjoy it, right? But if you're putting any kind of financial expectation on that, you're gonna come nose to nose with the real world. And for me right now, the real world is incredibly uncertain and unpredictable. And if you have something that's successful, great. You might be able to replicate it, but don't have that expectation. Like, just because something worked a year ago doesn't mean it's going to work today.
Yeah, that's really smart. So a lot of this that we've talked about has come around, like, having a network and building a network. What are some common mistakes you see when authors get excited about building a network and they start, like, reaching out to people? Where are you seeing them kind of, like, fall apart?
Yeah, this is there's many levels to this, I think.
This is a very complicated question.
Well, it is.
I asked it in, like, a simple way, but I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
this is a you and I could probably talk for like 2.5 hours on
no, man, this is why, like,
question.
Yeah, I love this. Why I love talking to you, because you really you think beyond the surface stuff, and it forces me to articulate things that live mostly in my head. So like so let's start with defining a few terms, right?
Mhm.
So a network, an author network would be peers, right? So as we use the term, and a network is like authors who are writing in the same genre who you could reach out to and cross promote with or get advice from. Like that's kind of a network, right?
Yeah.
And then you have an audience. So an audience is a group of people who are expecting communications from you, and you might have exchanges with them one-on-one, but they are not interacting with each other, right?
Interesting. Okay.
They're
I
an
like that a lot.
audience, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So if you go to a rock concert, you're in an audience. You know you may high five the person next to you, but you're not having a deep
Yeah.
conversation with them. You're not having dinner with them the week after to talk about the show.
Yeah, that'd be weird.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So that's an audience, right?
Okay.
And then you have a community. And a community is where people will rally around a particular person or a cause or a belief, and then they engage with each other. So those are three different aspects of relationships that are part of the author life, whether you're, a traditionally published author, an indie, whether you have one book out or 20. Network, audience, and community are sort of three different segments, so to speak.
Okay.
And now that I've defined that, I've completely forgotten your question.
Well, so I'm going to change my question. When you're talking about like, the PayPal test that you're sending out, is that to your network, your audience, or your community, or all three?
So for me, that was to my community, but you can totally do that with an audience.
Okay.
Like if you have an audience of 10 people, you can ask those 10 people their opinion on something, and you have real data. Like you have real substance, even if it might only be 10. But with as few as 10 people. And like I said, if you had 100 people, 100 people is a really great round number.
Yeah.
And I think it gives you a lot of, because with 10, how do you know you got the right 10 people? So yeah, I don't think the network applies there with the PayPal page link. I don't think you would.
You wouldn't send that
In
to your
fact,
peers.
I would discourage you from asking your peers on that. It's like asking an author a reader question, right?
Yeah.
Like if you ask an author, to read your book, they're going to say things that are relevant to as an author, but not as a reader.
Yeah. Giving you information like this has too much passive voice. Like that's yeah.
I'm sorry, man. I lost you there for a second.
Oh, I'm sorry. They're going to say things like this has too much passive voice. Something a reader would never say, right? Like
yeah.
So I want to stick on that like audience community parallel there for a second. You were saying that an audience is like a consumer group that's like coming to what you create as a consumer in order to receive the thing you're giving, whereas like community members have a like deeper tie to the meaning, message, and like cause potentially around what you're doing. It's interesting just processing that, because I feel like a lot of times as authors we think we're building a community, but with like KDP ads or like like running out like Facebook ads, we're actually building an audience. And as you make that distinction, I'm like, oh yeah, that's a mistake that I've made in the past, that I've built an audience and then I've expected them to behave like a community. Where I'm like, oh, here's my personal update. My audience is like, I don't give a crap about your personal update. Where's the next book? Like, so it's like that kind of, where would you encourage an author to focus in like this insane world that we've talked about, where like everything could change in a heartbeat? Like, do we build audience or do we build community? What should be our intention?
I don't think you have to choose between the two, and I don't think one is better than the other. You just need to know what you're trying to accomplish. Like you need to take a step back and say, what is it I'm trying to build here? If you're trying to bring people together, then that is a community. If you're trying to provide a service, that's more of an audience. And I'm using service in the broadest sense. Like if you're writing fiction and your service is letting people escape the real world for a few hours, then that's a service and that's an audience. So you just need to be intentional. I hear, especially in Web3, I hear that all the time. I hear, Web3 is all about community. And then I get in these quote unquote communities and they're nothing but an audience.
Yeah.
There's just a creator sending messages back and forth. And I'm like, that's not a community. If you have if you have a podcast, you don't have a community, you have listeners. Fine, right? It's an audience, but it's an audience, and you just got to recognize that. If you if you have a blog and you sell affiliate products, you have an audience, you don't have a community. So you just need to know what it is you want to accomplish. You need to be intentional about what you want to build, and you can build. I'm not saying like there's also this underlying assumption that somehow a community is better than an audience, and I reject that. I think it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. You can have a very fulfilling life, and you can have a wonderful sustainable source of revenue with an audience. You don't necessarily have to build a community, and I would go so far as to say that most authors should probably not try to build a community. Most authors have a skill set that is designed as an audience. I mean, the very act of writing a novel is creating an audience, not a community.
Interesting. So it's that community, would you say, is giving the participants the ability to interact with each other? Is that the difference between community and audience, or how do you define like this? I'm now building a community versus an audience, or an audience versus a community.
Right. So if members of your audience cannot communicate to each other, then it's not a community. Right. So some examples: if you have a Slack group, that's a community. If you have a Facebook group, that's a community. If you have an email list or a podcast, those are audiences.
Interesting. Okay. So in the like network community audience spectrum, where I'm tempted to ask about network, but we're also on a time crunch, so I'm gonna skip some questions in my head. Where does somebody like Stephen King fall? Because I would really like for him to be in my network, but he is not. So where does somebody that is not my peer fall in that realm?
I don't really know what Stephen King does on a day-to-day basis, but from an outside observation, it seems to me that he's just built a massive audience.
Yeah.
Like the biggest audience in the world. Like that's what it seems like to me.
If I want to get somebody like him into my network, what should I not do? But I ask you this because, you're talking to a lot of with Writers Inc. You're talking to a lot of high profile writers, right? Like, a lot of people that are like, oh, these are the greats of our generation, right? Like, they're not touted as Jane Austen yet, but some of them will be, right? Like, give them 10 years and we'll talk about them that way. So like, because I think when we talk network, there's a weird, unfortunate disdain for our peers and a deep desire to like elevate ourselves to people that we perceive as above us, whether or not they are, right? Like just like setting up that, internal desire to like reach those who are quote unquote great. And I think a lot of these like scale events that we were talking about before very much play on that desire. Like this person is going to be there and you are going to see this person. So like, knowing that we all have that internal desire to expand our network to people beyond our appropriate punching weight. What are the do's and don'ts of getting into that kind of circumstance?
Yes. Yeah, we are, we're all driven by status, whether we want to admit it or not. Even if you're living in a hippie commune out in Oregon, you care about status, right?
That's why you moved there.
Leading, right? I mean, that's what I won't get too far off on this tangent, but like that's the underlying behavioral motivator, I think, for everyone is status. That's what the money does. That's what the fame does. Like all the things we chase are to raise our status, and we want to compare our status to other people who have a similar status. That's and we're constantly ranking, we're constantly placing ourselves on the hierarchy. So given that, if you recognize that there is someone who you consider to be of a higher status than yourself within the same industry or within the same circles, I think the worst thing you can do is ask someone to pick their brain. I think that is highly disrespectful. And this comes across in different ways. It's like, hey, can we get coffee so I can pick your brain? I'm like, wow. So you just gave me homework, and like now I have this responsibility of teaching you, right?
Yeah.
Now I'm like, I think it's different on a podcast. Like, I'm not saying that for like a podcast. I'm talking about like a one-on-one interaction. Like, if you find out there's like a famous author in your town, and you email them and you're like, oh, I lived in the same town as you do. First of all, they're not going to care, but let's assume they do. And they're like, oh, I'd love to meet for coffee and pick your brain. Terrible, terrible
Yeah.
thing to do. And I will tell you, most people who get that pick your brain thing will not do it. Like, what's in it for them? Why would they? And I'm not saying people only do things for themselves, but that is a very selfish approach. So I think I heard, it might have been Tim Ferriss who talked about this, and whether I knew this ahead of time or whether I heard it from him, I'm not sure. But what I do, and I'm going to tie this into the Writers Inc. guess. What I do is I only ask people questions that I can't find anywhere else. And that only their unique experience will qualify them to answer that question. So, for example, I would never write to a high-powered indie author and I would be like, hey, I'm thinking about KU versus Wide. What should I do? That's a terrible, terrible question to ask, right? Because that information is out there ad nauseum, right? You should never be asking someone something you can Google. It's just lazy, right? I'm not your Google, right? So what I do is I read and I consume every piece of content that person has put out. So let's use JD Barker for a second, since we're friends and I can bust his chops publicly. Like, if I wanted to ask JD Barker a question, first thing I would do is I would read all of his books. If he had a blog, I would read all of his blog posts. If he had a podcast, I would listen to all of his podcast episodes. If I go through all of that and I still don't have an answer to my question, and I've Googled it and I've gone through all the resources and I still don't, then I know I have a question I feel like I can ask him. So let me give you an example. Like, let's say I'm trying to decide whether I should invest money in a German translation to sell foreign rights. Like, that's a highly specific question that only a handful of people in the world are going to be able to answer legitimately. And that might be a question. And the way I would phrase it to JD is I would say, here's my situation. I have this amount of money. I'm going to get a German translation. My plan is to run AMS ads in Germany for X number of months. I'm looking for this level of income by this amount of time. What do you think of this? Or would you do this? Right? I'm not putting the burden on him to come up with the plan. That's not fair. What I'm doing is I'm like, here's my plan. What do you think of it? And then someone like JD could be like, that looks awesome. And that's all it takes, right?
Yeah.
And so I might have gotten like a $1 million question answered because I did all the homework ahead of time to prepare it. So that's a totally off the cuff example, but basically you've got to know the person inside and out and know that you can't find the answer anywhere else, and then present your plan to them in succinctly as possible. Don't send them like a 10-page document, but like summarize the problem, tell them what you're thinking of doing, and then ask their opinion on it. And I guarantee you're going to get much better results doing that.
How do you feel about designing those kind of questions when you don't actually need the answer, but just to build connections with those people?
So, what would you hope to gain from those connections? Would be my question to you.
I mean, we talked about status before. I think there is a like status of like, this person is in my network and that makes me feel more successful.
Does it make you successful or make you feel successful?
Makes me feel successful. But I mean, what's the difference?
Well, you can't pay your mortgage with money that makes you feel like you're wealthy.
No, but I feel like at any minute I might be able to start paying my mortgage. Whereas before, when I was alone in my basement, I didn't feel that way at all. I asked that question seriously though, because I do find that like this strategy of like, hey, design the perfect question for the person with higher status often results in like, what can I figure out to ask this person? Does that make sense? So I'm just curious if like, is there value in that? I'm not necessarily disparaging that. I'm generally curious. Like, is that something that has advantages to it?
Well, so let's look at it from the other side. People love to help other people. Even selfishly, you get a certain satisfaction out of thinking like, wow, that person was really stuck, and I was the one that helped them out of that. Like there is some gratification there.
Yeah.
So I think what you do, I think in that situation, and I'm totally projecting, I could be completely wrong, but I think if I do all that work with JD and I ask him that question and he's like, yeah, dude, that's great. And then I do it and I come back to him 2 months later and be like, man, thanks for validating what I thought. This plan totally worked. I so appreciate your help. Just wanted to say thanks. That's kind of the beginning of a relationship. Like, and
Okay.
now, like, I think in that scenario, now, okay, JD is in my quote unquote network, but now I feel comfortable going back to him, and I think he's going to be really open to helping me again because of the way I framed my question.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. That's a good answer. Thank you for probing that with me a little bit. Okay, last question. I only have a couple minutes left, and then I gotta let you go. But I have to ask the question you ask everybody else. Where do you see publishing going in the next years? As we've talked about the inability to plan.
Yeah, I love how
What
I
are the
love you.
trends that you see happening?
Yeah, I love you turning the question on me.
I listen to you ask it every week, and I'm always like, I wonder what Jay thinks about that.
Yeah. I guess my overarching idea is highly fractionalized. Like as we're talking right now, Stephen King is testifying on behalf of the government on the publishing merger. Like there are going to become fewer and fewer publishers. You know, in
Another
5
headline, if you'd asked me like 3 years ago, like, hey, can you believe this is a headline? You'd be like, no, what are you talking about? That's
right.
insane. Yeah.
Exactly. You know, so
Yeah.
I think what we're headed towards is, you know, there might be Amazon and there might be one or two other corporations that are publishing books in the traditional way. But I don't think that's the future of publishing. Like it will still exist, but that isn't the future. I think the future is highly fractionalized, super niche sub genres. I think people developing a direct line of communication with their audience, or people building around communities in very small numbers. I mean, you look at other industries. You know, we don't. You know, the TV Nielsen ratings are irrelevant today. People don't sit around and watch the same shows on 3 networks the way they did 30 years ago. Music, Billboard is incredibly irrelevant now. There are musicians who are making music for hundreds of people and making a living on it. And I think authors are the same way. That's not to say I'm waving the indie flag against trad pop, but that's never been a fight that I've had a dog in. I don't really care about any of that. I'm just saying the future of publishing is going to be, in my opinion, is going to be a more direct line between the creator and consumer. And I think it's going to take it's going to take much smaller numbers to make that a reality.
How would you encourage new coming authors to organize their expectations, as we talked about before, for success in that environment?
This is the hardest part. You know, we all come in and we publish that first book, and then we wonder why we're not an international bestseller sitting on the beach writing books.
It's going to happen for me any second, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. You know, and that's part of that is our own problem. Like we have created these expectations, right? You look at all of the Amazon ads and Facebook courses, and you know, you can go 10x your revenue by running these ads, and like, I'm not saying that's false, but like you don't build a readership in 6 months or 9 months. You know, JD Barker was a ghostwriter for decades, you know. Even though that sort of rapid release indie model seems to be the one that people just all of a sudden appear, if you poke into that a little bit, or you look a little deeper, you'll find out that those people have been working hard at their craft and or their marketing for a long time. So I think I'm not trying to dampen expectations, or I'm not trying to make newer writers feel bad. I think there needs to be a realistic expectation in that it's really hard to build an audience or a community quickly. It's just that the nature of it just doesn't lend itself to that.
Well, and I appreciate that, because as you talked about earlier, setting up those expectations relieves pain on the long end.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, man. Well, thanks so much for doing this with me. I really appreciate it. I'm gonna stop the
Always
recording.
great talking to you, man.
I'm gonna stop the recording. We can talk a little more.